I've spent the past couple of months totally transforming the way that I communicate with my loved ones. Calling instead of texting sounded like such an easy thing to do, but when I actually started, I realized it's pretty hard to break such a common habit. When I first thought of this experiment, I considered this a new technology, even in the way that I wrote about it in my journals. This new technology was new to me, but actually was at one point the only way to communicate. So here's my claim. This technology isn't new, it's old. It's underappreciated and it's undervalued by this generation, myself included. But after spending weeks using it, I can honestly say we're wrong in thinking that this seemingly archaic technology is below us. Texting is convenient, sure, but it teaches you nothing about social skills or even orally presenting. Even people who grew up in previous generations are even becoming so accustomed to texting that they don't even consider calling anymore. This is a product of the digital age. With all the new technology that has come about over the past decades, we have totally abandoned wonderful and useful technologies that were at one point the only option. As if I hadn't disrupted my family and friends' lives enough to complete my experiment, to prove this, I've interviewed the people I've been calling instead of texting. This is to prove my theory that this bias of nonverbal communication stems from this generation of technology. Now, throughout my entire time doing the experiment, I've gotten mixed reactions from my family and friends. Although most rely on the convenience of texting, many do still appreciate a conversation over the phone because of its level of intimacy. I slowly incorporated this new technology into my life. It took me a while to realize who I can call and who I have to text, and even what times. It took me a while to get used to, but ultimately, I actually enjoyed this experiment. Here's my conclusion. Everyone has their own preference, and everyone has their own mode of communication that is convenient for them. But that doesn't mean that they use this form of communication to communicate with people every day or in every situation. Everyone has their own set of rules that they go by when deciding how to communicate, whether it's with a phone call, a text message, an email, or even a Skype call. Honestly, it comes down to the situation and the person and seriousness of the conversation that you're having. While doing this experiment, I established my own set of rules. These rules, I feel, are a consequence of society. I learned that there are certain ways to communicate with certain people. You wouldn't call someone you barely know, and you wouldn't text someone to tell him or her something that is extremely important. So now I have interviews from my family and friends that I've been calling instead of texting. Some of them gave a nicer interview than the comments that they have been giving me about calling them for the past few months. But nevertheless, it was interesting to see what they ultimately thought about the experiment.
One day, Hailey called me, and I could just tell by the sound of her voice that she was upset about something, and she needed me. And I don't think I would have been able to know that if she was texting me, because I would just be looking at the words that she was texting, and I wouldn't be able to hear the tone of her voice. And when she called me, she didn't have to say she needed me. She didn't have to say she was in trouble. But just by the tone of her voice, I knew that she needed me. So I think talking in person is the best thing. And I really was so happy that she called me at that moment rather than texting me, because I got to know so much more by just listening to her voice.
So that was my mom, and the time she's referring to is actually a time I'm not too proud of, but I got pulled over by a cop for having a taillight out. So I actually called her on the phone, and I was shaking. She can tell that I was so nervous. And there's two reasons why I called her instead of texting her in that moment, because if I had texted her, first of all, I couldn't guarantee that she would answer right away, and second of all, because I was just so nervous. I just needed to talk to her because that was the first time I had ever been pulled over, and I was just shaking with nervousness and fear. So to hear her voice calmed me down, and you can't get that calming effect over a text message because, first of all, the time it takes someone to respond and the level of non-intimacy, I guess you can say, because there's nothing like just hearing the person you love's voice on the other line rather than waiting for them to just type a few words on a screen.
My granddaughter, Hailey, has been calling me over the past few weeks on the telephone. I really didn't recognize her voice because she no longer calls me. She texts, and I really know nothing about texting. I don't like it. I think it's stopping kids from interacting with each other, and I really like the sound of her voice on a phone rather than her fingers texting. Thank you.
So that was my grandma, and she obviously is a proponent of calling instead of texting. She has been trying to learn how to text for the past few years, but it's not really working. So she definitely appreciated the fact that I was calling her instead of texting her. Um, I would call her and she would pick up on the first ring, and that was pretty much the only person who picked up on the first ring. But it was just great to actually pick up the phone and call her and hear her voice and her hear my voice because you don't really get that unless you're face to face with the person. So I think it was just really good for bonding because you just get to hear the person, you get to hear their personality shine through, and you don't get to hear that in a text message. So you actually get to hear the person's personality rather than just a couple of words on a screen. So I think it made all the difference calling her instead of texting her, and I think that I'm just going to continue to do that even after the experiment's over. I guess my grandma preferred when I called her instead of texted her because she grew up in a time when they didn't have texting. So she's so used to calling that this idea of texting is so like abnormal to her. So this is where I saw that age and whether you like texting or not had a correlation because she obviously prefers calling because that's what she's used to and that's what she grew up with. So as opposed to the rest of my family who is younger and from a different generation, they prefer the texting because it's more convenient. When my grandma was younger, they didn't worry about convenience. They worried about forming everlasting relationships, which we're not really as concerned with anymore. We're more so concerned with getting things done quick and fast, and we're not really worried about in the future. We're worried about right now. So I think she appreciates the fact that I've been calling her instead of texting her because she gets to experience us in the way that she experienced people back in the day because we're actually using a mode of communication that she's used to and that she appreciates.
I feel like that the annoying part of my sister calling me instead of texting is when I'm with my friends. Like, instead of texting, she calls me, causing communication problems because of the background noise.
So that was my brother, and you can tell obviously that he did not like it when I called him. He's at the age where all he wants to do is hang out with his friends, and he doesn't want his annoying big sister calling him on the phone. So whenever I would want to talk to him, I would call him, and he would get mad because I was embarrassing him or I was interrupting his play date with his friends. So he definitely did not like when I called instead of texted him. So I will probably go back to texting him after this experiment's over, and I think he's going to be more than fine with that.
For the past few weeks, Haley's been calling me on the phone, and I like it a lot better than texting because I could tell if my jokes are actually funny and she actually laughs, or rather than her just saying LOL, even if she doesn't find my jokes funny. And I like to hear her voice instead of texting her.
So that was my sister, and I think she was kind of split in the fact that she liked when I called her, but she also appreciated when I texted her because, like me, she is busy a lot of the time. So I'm sure she didn't appreciate when I texted her when she was on her way back from cheer practice or with her friends. So I think she appreciated the fact that I called her, like she said, because she got to hear if I thought her jokes were funny, which she doesn't realize that you can fake laugh and not actually find them funny. But I liked hearing her voice because we never really see each other, so it's good to actually hear her on the phone. But I will use discretion, I guess, when deciding whether to call or text her because I do understand that she's busy, like I am. So I guess when I just want to talk to her, I will find a time when we can both actually talk on the phone. But otherwise, I guess I'll just text her to avoid her from having to worry about me interrupting her.
I really enjoy talking on the phone as opposed to texting. It's nice to hear Hailey's voice since I go to school upstate and we don't see each other every day anymore. It's definitely more time consuming than texting, but it's much more meaningful and much more worth it, I think, because we can actually hear each other's voices and laughs. And so I know we'll continue calling and FaceTiming each other for the rest of the school year.
That was my best friend Brooke. She goes to school in Binghamton. Since we're about 3 hours from each other on any given day, communication is hard, especially since our schedules obviously don't line up and we're so busy all the time. This experiment has actually made our relationship stronger because we actually wound up calling each other a few times a week to catch up as opposed to texting each other once a weekend. There is no comparison between talking to her on the phone and sending her a simple text. Like she said, we got to hear each other laugh and just tell stories, and there's no substitute for that unless you're face to face. And because we're so far away, that's not really plausible. Because I was calling her, I was able to talk to her pretty much while I was doing anything. While I was driving, I had her on speakerphone. While I was taking my dog for a walk, I had her on speakerphone. It was just a lot more natural, I guess you can say. We didn't actually have to schedule a time as the experiment went on because we would just call each other and see if the other one would pick up, and if not, we would just call back a little while later. It actually made more sense to call her because of the stories we wanted to tell each other. And honestly, it actually was beneficial for our relationship, like I said before, because we actually got to hear each other's voices and hear each other laugh. And since I've been at college, I can't really get that unless she comes home for the weekend or I go up there. So this experiment actually proved that just because you're far away from someone doesn't mean that you can't have the same relationship. It's just you can't have the same relationship when you're texting.
Hey Haley, it was nice talking to you, even though it took a while for us to actually get in contact with each other. To be honest, I think I would have preferred if we texted, just because in today's day and age, more people like to text, and it's a lot easier since everyone has busy schedules and, like, not everyone can reach in contact with each other all the time. So I think I would have just preferred texting. And also with like phone calls, it's difficult to reach a time that both recipients are available to talk. So it's harder to get back to people when they leave voicemails and whatnot. So yeah, even though it was nice talking to you, we did play a lot of phone tag. But hope to talk to you again soon.
So that was my best friend Marina, and she goes to school right here at Adelphi, so it's usually pretty easy to get in touch with each other because we're able to see each other on the weekends and after class and stuff. But like she said, it's really hard to get in touch because we play a lot of phone tag. Because even though we're so close, we still have classes and work. But it is good to have a meaningful conversation, but it is difficult to get in touch. And like she said, sometimes it's easier just to text each other.
When Haley first called me, I found it weird because we would normally text each other. I found it inconvenient because it was very time consuming. I still prefer texting because it's quick, easy, and you don't have to answer right away.
So that was my best friend Janine, and she goes to school right here too. So she knows what it's like with the scheduling and stuff. As you can see, she definitely did not like when I called her instead of texted her because she works all the time and she's always so busy with all her clubs and activities. So she is definitely a proponent of texting instead of calling, and I don't blame her because we definitely played a lot of phone tag. So, and as you can see, I text a lot because she was so surprised when I called her instead of texted her. So, because it took a while for us to get in touch with each other, I guess it would have been just easier to text her and waited for her to get back to me. So, I probably will go back to texting her instead of calling her when it's not urgent and when it's not something I really want to tell her that's going to take too long to text. But, yeah, she definitely did not like when I called her instead of texting her.
I guess texting is easier, but calling is better when you want to have a longer conversation. We talked a lot on the phone, and I had a better conversation, but it was hard to find a time when we could both talk at the same time since we were so busy.
So that was my friend David, and he likes to text, so I guess that's why he didn't really like the whole trying to get in touch with each other thing. But he's right, we did have more meaningful conversations, I guess. We just had longer conversations, and I think that was better for us because we were actually able to hear each other's voices, and actually able to tell stories without having to go back and forth with texting.
I feel that calling was more difficult than texting. It was It was really hard to get in touch. I prefer texting. It's just easier and more effective because I don't like to talk to people.
So that was my friend Jake, and as you can see, he hates talking on the phone, so he hated this experiment. I had to actually beg him to let me call him so I can get information for the experiment. But he gets, I don't know if it's nervous talking on the phone, but he definitely does not like calling. So I will definitely go back to texting him because I put him through a lot of torture with this experiment. Like I said earlier, I think overall it's dependent on the situation that you're in and who you're texting. So obviously, I'm going to continue calling my grandma instead of texting her because that's what she prefers. But when it comes to friends that I talk to more often, I might go back to texting them when it comes to small, minuscule things, but then calling them when it comes to more urgent things that I want to tell them. So I think it depends mostly on the person that you're talking to and what you kind of want to talk to them about, because I think that plays a major role in whether you should call or text. And I think I learned a lot from this experiment because I actually learned how to communicate with people in a way that's most effective for the conversation I want to have. So, like I wrote in my journals, when it came to my boss, I wasn't calling her on the phone. I was emailing her and I was texting her because that's what's more appropriate for that situation. But when it comes to a friend who lives far away, I'm obviously going to call her when I want to hear about what's going on with her life and hear about all the fun, exciting things she's doing. So I think it comes down to what you feel most comfortable with in that situation, and not so much something you have to stick with every time you want to communicate with them, just the conversation that you're going to have. And I think that this experiment actually taught me a lot about myself and the ways I like to communicate with people. And I think I will continue communicating with some people with calling that I wouldn't have called in the past. So I think overall this experiment did teach me a lot about communication and getting in touch with people and relationships. The theory that I proposed at the beginning of this podcast was that us preferring texting or calling is dependent on what generation we came from. So my parents came from a different generation, but they obviously have grown accustomed to this generation because they prefer texting instead of calling. But they do appreciate the value of a conversation when it is over the phone. So I think it's how we have incorporated this generation's technology into our own lives. So my grandmother, she obviously has had more of a difficult time incorporating texting and the internet into her life because she wasn't used to it. She didn't grow up with it. But me and my friends and my siblings, we all prefer texting because that's all we know. We didn't grow up calling people on the phone. We grew up texting them. So I think it's dependent on the generation that you come from and how easily you're able to adapt the new technologies into your lives. So I do believe that generation and age does have a lot to do with whether you prefer calling or texting. But ultimately, I think that it comes down to an individual and their preferences.